Yeah, it's so great to be in person with everybody in the convocation hall. It's been a while that we've been doing the climate talks on Zoom, but I think now is a really great time to get together and really talk about difficult, complex issues. So we're so excited to have Bruce Santiago here today. I'm sure many of you have heard about her, but we actually had the privilege to get to know her last year. She was actually carrying Emory's badge to go to the UN climate negotiation. So we were so privileged to be able to support her work. And I just wanted to talk a little bit about what she does. We can take up all the hours. We're not going to do the long introduction, but she's been working with the community and advocating and on different environmental issues, energy issues, and climate justice issues that she's going to be talking about. She's worked with fishers associations and other organizations, apparently over 30 years of her life, and ranging from community newspaper, children's services, community school, ecotourism projects, etc. Last night, when we had the conversation, it was such an amazing range of topics that she was able to talk about: the coal ash, and the nuclear power plants, and the solar panels, and the bees, and the wind energy. And I'm just so excited that you're actually able to hear directly from her. I know that at Emory, we don't have environmental justice or energy justice classes at the college level, and that has been a really big issue. And I hope that this is one step ahead to actually be able to meet with the person that is really on the forefront of the topic to really let you know what is going on. And I just wanted to say that she has been serving on the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council as well. So she will be able to give you a lot of different perspectives on the issues too. And if anybody is interested in giving some donations, she's mentioned the organization called El Puente de Williamsburg, Inc. But the project itself is Latino Climate Action Network in Puerto Rico. So they have a headquarters apparently in New York, but then the office in Puerto Rico, and that's what she suggested. So we're going to post that information later, but if any of you are interested. With that, I would like her to take the floor, and please give her the warm welcome. The microphone.
So hello, everyone. Really happy to be here. It's been great. Special thanks to Professor Saikawa. And yeah, this is a beautiful campus, and I've been able to talk with some of the students. I'm very impressed on their knowledge and array of subjects that they're working on. And so this has been a really wonderful experience. Thank you for this invitation. Happy to be here. So I'll jump right in. Since we have a bit of time, I want to mix this up with a little bit of different formats. So I'll start with a little something I wrote, and then we'll go to the slides, and then we'll have a Q&A. But feel free, like even during the talk and during the slides, to jump in if you have a burning question that you want to ask. I don't mind being interrupted, and it actually helps, you know, to focus in on what the audience is interested in, right? Yeah, so I'll get started. So I sort of switched up the title of what I wrote, but it's basically the same thing. You know, this experience with Hurricane Maria 5 years later, and how we go from that to achieving energy, climate, and environmental justice in Puerto Rico, and with some aspects that are applicable in a wider context. So next week marks the 5th anniversary of Hurricane Maria, the passage of the hurricane in Puerto Rico, or through Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands. At the time, it seemed like all eyes were on the devastation wrought by the Category 4, almost Category 5 hurricane. Hurricane Maria destroyed and damaged hundreds of thousands of homes, tore up roads, bridges, and other infrastructure, downed 80% of the centralized grid, resulting in a complete power outage. And I guess you all saw the news. And that power outage in some places extended for nearly a year in some communities. And so the press and all kinds of publications, I remember especially Newsweek, writing something about Puerto Rico's, it was called Puerto Rico's Hurricane Maria power outage is now the world's second largest blackout. And that was pretty devastating. And so, of course, the larger context is that the more intense hurricanes, storms, wildfires, and other climatic events increasingly are disabling energy delivery through electric transmission and distribution, what are basically the lines, the poles, the towers, the transformers, substations, all of this infrastructure, right, that gets the energy from centralized plants to the point of use. We're seeing all of these climatic events impacting that conventional centralized system. And so from the Caribbean to the Gulf Coast, the Eastern Seaboard, and along the West Coast of the United States, communities are increasingly contending with power outages provoked by down T&D systems, or transmission distribution systems. And for all of the reasons that we mentioned. So it's not just hurricanes, it's other storms, it's vegetation growth, it's wildfires, different impacts to these systems. Electric power lines are sometimes igniting or aggravating wildfires in California. For example, one headline read, P&G power lines blamed for Northern California wildfires. Last year, Hurricane Ida tore down the T&D system in New Orleans, you might recall, and Hurricane Nicholas wreaked havoc on the electric grid in Texas, right? And there was a headline that said, Nicholas leaves more than 100,000 Texas electricity customers without power, right? So in light of this situation, civil society groups are increasingly holding rogue utilities like Entergy in Louisiana to account. And for example, the Deep South Center for Environmental Justice, it talks about energy and justice in New Orleans, like power to the people. Communities are becoming energy literate and putting forth proposals for energy system transformation. And that's the case with an initiative that I am part of, a co-founder of, we call it We Want Sun, in Spanish, Queremos Sol, a civil society proposal for transformation, radical transformation of the electric system in Puerto Rico. But in spite of the lofty renewable energy goals and zero emissions targets, government agencies that are in the grips of utility capture frequently fail to follow through on the energy transformation agenda, and much less take assertive steps to facilitate community and civil society empowerment to implement critical, potentially life-saving measures for essential electric service. Puerto Rico is the poster case for of this type of energy injustice, which was what I just described. So as we mark the 5th anniversary of Hurricane Maria, a cursory view of the electric system in Puerto Rico casts a disappointing and potentially lethal tally. After the hurricane, the centralized transmission distribution system, which runs primarily from southern Puerto Rico, which is sort of in environmental justice parlance, the sacrifice zone, right? The southern coast has most of the big power plants. The two most polluting plants are in southeastern Puerto Rico, where I'm located, in Salinas and Guayama, if you're familiar with the island. And so those plants run along the southern coast, and then the energy demand centers, as you know, I don't want to get too technical with the terminology here, but so the big points of use are on the northern coast, and mostly in the San Juan metropolitan area. And so the way the system is designed, it's very centralized, and then it runs from south to north, and the hurricanes come in from east to west. And what happens almost every time is that it gets knocked out to some extent, and in the case of Hurricane Maria, almost entirely. So, yeah, I just rephrased what I had written, so let me get, okay, so that's part of what's still happening. That's still the design. That has not been modified in any way. And also, this system has been stood up amid scandals of US-based companies like Whitefish and Cobra Energy profiting handsomely from dubious work. And then a New York-based company called New Fortress Energy built a liquefied natural methane gas terminal to import highly volatile methane gas that is frequently inoperable and without the necessary authorization from the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission that you may have heard of, known as FERC. Other things, the Punta Lima wind farm was blown away by the hurricane, and as was a utility scale land-based solar array near where the storm made landfall, right? So all these things were destroyed basically. And we still have a Virginia-based company called AES, Applied Energy Systems, that operates a coal-fired power plant in my area, especially in Guayama, Puerto Rico, southeastern PR, that continues to spew toxins and contaminate the South Coast aquifer. We have a new grid operator, a joint venture created by Quanta Services. You may have heard of. It's the largest transmission company in the US, based in Texas. And they created a joint venture with ATCO Canadian Utilities called Luma Energy, and things have gotten worse. If you've seen any of the news recently coming out of Puerto Rico, we were discussing with them both last night and earlier today that in the past month, all the major hospitals in Puerto Rico have been without power, not because they didn't plan for, say, an outage, but because even the generators that they use to kick in when there is an outage of the grid, the main grid, have been damaged by voltage fluctuations, which apparently have to do with mismanagement of the grid by Luma Energy. So I mean, incredible that it could get worse, but it's worse. And so this company, especially the Luma Energy, is, as I said, performing even worse than the Puerto Rico Electric Power Authority, while lobbying to rebuild the existing centralized fossil enabling T&D system with a historic amount of federal disaster recovery funds that have been allocated for the electric system in Puerto Rico. And the government of Puerto Rico and the local energy bureau, which is sort of equivalent to the part of the Public Service Commission in Puerto Rico that regulates utilities, for example, has failed after each hurricane and sometimes during lesser storms too. And utility scale renewable energy projects like the ones that took 15 months to reconnect to the grid after Hurricane Maria have not really helped the situation. And then they're proposing more of these. So clearly, we're not talking about merely technological solutions. What I just mentioned about utility scale renewable energy projects, it shows that even decarbonizing is not enough, right? And as Professor Catalina de Onís, who wrote a great book called Energy Islands, notes, we need to decarbonize, decentralize, very important, democratize and decolonize, or lessen the dependence on imported fossil fuels in Puerto Rico. So further context in Puerto Rico, Governor Pedro Pierluisi, who is currently in office, took power with barely 32% of the vote, is asking the Federal Emergency Management Agency to hand over 15 billion, 15, maybe 16 at this point. I think, and I said billion, B with a not M, not a, right? So this historic amount of funds, 9.6 billion of which have been already allocated to rebuild the centralized transmission distribution system. Really, really problematic. And even to add new methane gas-fired power plants, and not one penny for distributed renewable energy. And so, yeah, as I mentioned, civil society groups have gotten together, and that means community, environmental, academic, labor, professional groups, etc. And even religious groups have later endorsed this civil society proposal called We Want Sun, or Queremos Sol, and there's a website for that, which you'll see in the slides a little later on. And the current juncture is that the government of Puerto Rico has the option at the end of November to either continue with the Luma energy contract and allow them to rebuild the centralized grid, or really take a different direction and move this historic amount of funds towards distributed renewables for especially rooftop solar for the large low medium income population in Puerto Rico that could not otherwise access this type of resilient energy option. And that really means could mean, you know, the difference between life and death in many cases. We saw after Hurricane Maria, you may recall different studies, but basically everyone agrees that at least 3,000 people perished, died in the aftermath, especially some during the hurricane, but really the bulk after Hurricane Maria, and especially because of lack of electric service, lack of power to operate life-saving medical equipment, or refrigerate medication, or have access to just medical procedures because of lack of power. And we saw that again, as I said, a couple of weeks ago. So it's still happening. Basically what we're calling for as civil society is universal access to resilient power to Puerto Rico residents, businesses, and institutions. And so I'll talk a little bit about what we've done as community, environmental, and nonprofit organizations in the meantime in these past 5 years. Various community groups and philanthropic organizations. In fact, today we published something in the Nonprofit Quarterly about some of the work that we do. Have built a few rooftop solar and battery energy storage projects throughout Puerto Rico, but the pace and the scale of these alternatives is dwarfed by the proposed rebuild of the centralized grid. I mean, we don't have access to $16 billion or anything near that through the philanthropic organizations. I mean, we did one small rooftop solar project with less than 100,000, like around $100,000. Okay, so yeah, we really need to change the flow of funds. We're seeing that the higher income individuals are installing rooftop solar and storage systems, but with close to 44% poverty rate, most people in Puerto Rico just can't access, right, the life-saving resiliency that these systems can provide. Not leasing, and certainly not outright purchasing, right? So it's just not, there's no energy justice there. So this is very much a matter of equity, environmental, climate, and energy justice. And so we're calling on the Biden-Harris administration to take this unique opportunity and make good on its commitment to tackle the climate crisis and center environmental justice by showcasing Puerto Rico as an example of what disaster recovery funds can do to transform the electric system. Using FEMA funds to rebuild the Puerto Rico grid would be a terrible waste of taxpayer funding. Taxpayer money, and that of course has to do with people throughout the states, right? Now I want to switch gears a little bit. I couldn't resist the temptation to talk about the Inflation Reduction Act because it's a very current topic, and there are some implications for Puerto Rico and beyond. So I mean, we all know about the questionable parts of the statute, right? But even the good parts, there are concerns with by fence line communities, environmental justice communities, and communities already overburdened by polluting power plants, especially in general. The heavy reliance on tax credits and rebates in the IRA is not necessarily helpful to low-income communities, especially to most residents in Puerto Rico, right? So if your opportunity to switch appliances to more efficient equipment, or your access to rooftop solar or to electric vehicles, if that depends on a rebate, that means you have to have the upfront money, right? And usually, and then also if it depends on a tax credit, again, yeah, that might not be accessible to low and medium income communities throughout the states, and especially a case in Puerto Rico. So in a sense, the IRA is a missed opportunity for increased options, decarbonizing options like mass transit, income-dependent subsidies for shifting to electric appliances, and other forms of progressive economic measures. And of course, we know that, yes, this is the first climate bill that passed by the US Congress. It's historical, but unfortunately, it does mandate offering up the Gulf of Mexico and Alaska's Cook Inlet for oil and gas development. It also requires additional oil and gas leasing in order for new wind and solar projects to be approved. It enables the Mountain Valley Pipeline, controversial project. And it has a side deal to approve a separate bill to amend the National Environmental Policy Act, no less, right? A bedrock environmental law that especially provides an avenue for public participation in these really significant environmental decisions. And, the IRA requires the president to establish 25 priority projects on federal lands that must include fossil fuels and nuclear energy. It revises a section of the Clean Water Act in a way that would make it more difficult to block or delay pipeline projects, includes support for carbon capture and sequestration, and could be used to extend the life of fossil-fired power plants and toxic pollution that fence-line communities are exposed to. So, yeah, I wanted to say that. And so now I guess I'll go to the slides. So it's going to be sort of visualizing some of the points that I made in this presentation. Okay, so should I use this?
You're right.
Oh, so here, okay, I'm terrible at this. All right, so summarizing, what were the lessons learned from Hurricane Maria? Oh, can I eliminate this?
Sorry.
Whatever, we'll leave it there.
Oh, here. Okay. Is this better?
Yeah, that's definitely better.
Yeah.
All right, so what were the lessons hopefully learned? From that 2017 hurricane season, which, actually were two hurricanes. It was Hurricane Maria a few days before Hurricane Irma. Sorry, the opposite, Hurricane Irma a few days before. And Hurricane Irma was an actual Category 5, but it didn't make a direct hit. It went off, veered off towards the north, east coast of Puerto Rico. So Hurricane Maria and other so-called natural disasters, which we know have been exacerbated by anthropogenic causes. I mean, you're all climate familiar with these terms, exacerbated by the climate crisis, destroyed, as I mentioned, the centralized electric grid, transmission and distribution. And communities, I think, realized in Puerto Rico and maybe, elsewhere, other observers, that they can become energy literate, and that the traditional narrative about electric systems has been, oh my gosh, that's just too complicated. And it's something, energy system issues or electric issues, that's like for big utilities to handle, and, communities or environmental or organizations, not profits, that really have nothing to do there. And I think we learned that that was not true. And that fortunately, although I'm not talking about strictly technological solutions, that yes, the technology has facilitated participation, right? And not only to become energy literate, but implement energy efficiency and otherwise participate in the electric system. We also realized, of course, that PREPA, the public utility, needs a radical transformation, both in terms of technology and governance. And that community empowerment through participation in the electric system as not just passive consumers, but as producers. And so what is known as prosumers in that lingo is definitely an option. And the reason why I call this Puerto Rico's Energy Green New Deal is that this historic amount of FEMA and HUD funding, right? It's, just think of it, it is the largest public assistance. It's public because it goes to a public utility. Public assistance allocated for the electric system is the largest in FEMA's history. I mean, that's how big it is. And when you compare these numbers, like 16 billion to, for example, what's in the IRA, right? Like, I mean, there may be a few hundred million for some of these things, but there's a lot of money there, and it's a lot of taxpayer money, and it needs to be used wisely and should not be part of this vicious cycle of repairing and then, you know, having the next hurricane knock down again and destroy, and then using federal funds again to rebuild. We should really change the design here. And so that necessary transformation of the electric system can be done with an earmarking of the federal funds so that the public utility works with organized communities and local renewable energy contracts to build a decentralized renewable electric system based on rooftop solar and batteries and similar alternatives, which we advocate will lead to energy democracy. Oh my, sorry, I'm so technologically illiterate. I so don't know why.
On this, and then if it doesn't, you can.
Okay, great. Sorry about that. Okay, so yeah, so this is the part of the civil society proposal that we have collaborated with and are co-founders of. It's known as We Want Sun. That's the web page. It's available in English and in Spanish, and it's based basically on the transformation of the Puerto Rico Electric Power Authority and the grid generally, and the electric system overall, towards a decentralized system based on primarily, because the studies, there have been quite a few really good studies on how the viability of moving to, especially rooftop solar. I don't know, I think I have a little bit about the history of the Puerto Rico development that'll show why that, yeah, it's right here. Okay, so in the larger context, you probably know that even the news about the hurricane was really, yeah. No problem. Sure. Yeah. Okay. So decentralization is distributing energy generation, energy production at lots of different smaller sites, as opposed to having centralized big plants, and even not just fossil-fired plants, but also utility scale. Renewable energy is a centralized form of generating energy that is dependent on transmission. So the lines that you have high voltage lines and the towers and the poles, that is still, even though it's renewable technology, it's still very centralized. In the Puerto Rico context, and I think in a lot of other places, you can do something totally different that cuts out that transmission cost, especially transmission cost and vulnerability and risks, and go to direct energy supply using rooftops or parking lots or nearby areas in order to be more efficient about energy delivery. Right. So so going to the general context. So the news about Hurricane Maria was really just one in a series of headlines in the previous years about not only the electric system, but the economy in Puerto Rico, right? And you probably know that Puerto Rico basically went bankrupt as early as probably 2014, but officially filed 2016, 2017. And what were the reasons behind that? Well, I posit that you know, this development policy based on the most generous tax exemptions, probably historically in the world, and other incentives to attract private investment, especially US companies, but also other international companies, that basically led to bankrupting the government, right? No money for services. And so the whole economic development model based on these tax exemptions was done with the promise of creating lots of employment that never really happened, right? And so we've always had very high unemployment rates, even with the exodus of people to the States, right? Which has always been a thing in Puerto Rico and the Caribbean in general, right? That's happened a lot. And so, you know, always had very high unemployment rates. And in my area, which is what Dr. Hilda Llorens calls the periphery of the periphery. Yeah, so in classic environmental justice communities, it's always been higher than the average in Puerto Rico. And as I mentioned, the poverty rate is very high. So this economic model, it didn't seem to work, right? The median household income is like 1/3 of the US median. And yet we pay, I think now at least, probably the highest electric rate in the entire nation. And the debt, of course, that was restructured already for the central government is quite high. And also that is in addition to the government obligations to pension funds. So of course that led to mass migration, and actually even before the hurricane, the 700,000 people, I think all told, many working age people, professionals, doctors have left. And so this is exacerbated in, as I mentioned, the environmental justice communities that are overburdened and have higher poverty rates and are largely Afro-descendant populations, especially in southeastern PR and northeastern PR and in coastal areas where the traditional economy was sugarcane cultivation, and that slaves were brought in to do that kind of work. Yeah, and so that has been coupled with the lack of services. So school closings, hospital closings, right when we're seeing a lot of the environmental impacts of these polluting power plants. So there's just, I guess, too much on that slide. So one definition of energy justice is that the goal of achieving equity in both the social and economic participation in the energy system, while also mediating social, economic, and health burdens on those disproportionately harmed by the energy system. That's one possible definition. I think it's pretty good. And I think we're just going in the wrong direction, where we're very clearly seeing two very unequal energy systems in Puerto Rico, where, as I mentioned, high income people and residents are acquiring or leasing the rooftop solar and battery storage systems. Low and middle income residents largely did not have access to that life-saving energy options. But as I mentioned, you know, small community-based and nonprofit solar projects have sprung up, some of which are mentioned. But as I said, the Puerto Rico Medical Center was without power for 16 hours a few weeks ago. And then the utility scale projects, renewable energy projects are being sited on prime agricultural land. We are an island that has been described as a mountain range surrounded by a narrow coastal plain, limited geography. Yeah. Governance. Yeah. Yeah.
So, if you could turn on microphone work. The people on Zoom couldn't hear you. So if you have a question, just flag me down so that the people on Zoom can hear too. Ruth, can you repeat the question and then answer?
Right.
When you talk about decentralization of energy, do you mean geographically or physically, or also in terms of management, and how that would look?
Yeah, both, definitely both. And so the geographic, or as you say, the physical decentralization has to do with what we mentioned, lots of distributed energy producers, like even at the household level, business level, institutional level, having mostly in the case of Puerto Rico, panels and better energy storage systems, and you know, energy efficiency measures and all of the options to centralized fossil fire generation. And then as to the governance, of course, right, and having a whole series of measures to democratize the public utility and have a real effective representation of communities and different civil society sectors in the governance of the public utility. So that's one way. Also, there's been talk about creating other institutions to like microgrids, for example, to generate energy locally and under local control. Yeah, so definitely governance is a part of it as well, the decentralization. And so unfortunately, I was at these utility scale renewable energy projects on prime agricultural land, very limited land space on the islands especially. And importantly, they took over 1 year, I think about 15 months to reconnect. So even if they're renewable, that doesn't really solve your problem if they depend on the transmission grid that is down, right? If it's centralized, in other words. And so we're also seeing proposals for new methane gas, which is unfortunately one of the provisions in our energy public policy law that was passed in 2019 that perpetuates the centralized grid versus studies on the viability of rooftop solar. So, for example, the National Renewable Energy Lab just I guess about a month ago released information that says that Puerto Rico has 20 gigawatts, i.e. 20,000 megawatts worth of rooftop solar potential, which is much more than the energy demand of the whole archipelago. So, yeah.
Related to your question. Related to the decentralization of the governance is there was Luma, La Junta, and went from IAM. What other proposals are there being placed are different from what has been tried for years?
Hola, Boricua. Okay, so yes, yeah, that's the question right now that the Luma contract and management and operation of the grid has been so problematic, and everyone is asking what happens after November 30th, right? I mean, presumably the government could just extend it, right? If all parties agree, extend that supplementary agreement that's in place right now. That's a possibility. There could be allow that contract to expire and not renew. And in that case, there are some other options, right? Which would be, one is that operation and management of the grid would go back to PREPA, or there could be another private contractor to come in, which what I've heard would be really difficult because the terms would be just so onerous, even more burdensome than the terms of the Luma contract. And there could be some kind of transition phase. I mean, there would be, I believe, as I recall, even if the Luma contract is not renewed or not continued after November 30th, there's a transition phase that they would have to continue to operate until something else happened. So I think the only real option would be for PREPA to take back, because they had the workforce. I mean, they could call back the workforce that Luma never hired, and which is part of the problem, right? Because it's a very complex system, and Luma chose not not to honor the collective bargaining agreement. People were placed in other agencies, but they're still there. There's, we believe, right? And so that could be phased back in. And as I said, I think ultimately PREPA, which has this huge allocation of funds, has to work with civil society, organized community groups that are doing some of these projects, local contractors. I mean, for once, and I think, you know, this is a common experience. For once, we need disaster recovery funding to benefit the local economies, right? And not be part of the disaster industry complex, right? And I think Llewellyn wrote a law review article about how in NOLA, you know, they've had this experience with, I think he calls it the iron triangle, where it just doesn't work for disaster recovery of local places. Yeah, so we will see. We will certainly see what happens. I mean, keep your eye on that issue, because it seems it's going to be a really defining issue for Puerto Rico's future. So this is what I mean by centralized electric grid, right? And electric power system. So this is in my area. This is the AES coal-fired power plant. This was an interesting story. I don't know how much I can go into it, but you can see it's a relatively modern plant. It's a coal-fired power plant that was supposed to be part of the clean coal technology. It started operation November 2002, and boy, what a disaster. I mean, they've polluted the South Coast Aquifer. They admitted that they polluted the South Coast Aquifer with the coal ash waste. They've totally mismanaged their coal combustion residuals. They've got a scandal in the Dominican Republic where they took this coal ash waste. They are now dumping the coal ash waste here in Georgia, in Chester Island, Georgia. Prior to that, it was being shipped to Florida, a landfill in Florida. There was a boat full of coal ash waste from this plant capsized near the Florida coast. You know, just, I mean, they've got a notice of violation pending for their emissions and their reporting, and it's a really bad actor. Unfortunately, it seems as the activists in Puerto Rico say that the government in Puerto Rico, that the governor was worked with a firm that advised this company prior to taking office. And so he just handed over 4 new, I think actually 6 new contracts to this company to do utility scale renewables. And I don't know how we do this with an environmental actor like this. And then the second plant here is in Salinas, where I'm located, and it's the largest electrical facility in Puerto Rico, and also very problematic. It's been working under a consent decree with EPA since 1999 for, you know, environmental violations, and it's been a huge battle with them for many years. And so they together and 2 other big plants in the south and southwestern PR transmit the energy mostly for the San Juan metro area and other areas as well. So yeah, really concerning to see FEMA, you know, take this stance that, for example, this huge amount of federal spending, which is definitely a major federal action, does not consider a reasonable alternative like distributed renewables. And we think that FEMA is really not taking into account environmental justice, unfortunately, in spite of the Biden administration policies and the executive order 14008, et cetera. And all the potential is there. The Bipartisan Budget Act flexibilizes the use of Stafford Act funds for and the electric system. And, you know, as we mentioned, NEPA, ESA, National Historic Preservation Act, all these executive orders, all these authorities allow and require, more importantly, the Biden administration to consider the civil society option that I mentioned. And so, yeah, this is the issue. Do we rebuild the existing centralized fossil-fired power plants, and look at that grid covered with vegetation. I mean, it's like, how can you maintain that? And, you know, we need people and groups in the states to advocate for use of these FEMA and HUD funds for a transformation of the electric system in Puerto Rico, because obviously we don't have voting power as a territory and a colony of the US. Okay, so this is impossible to read, right? So I just wanted to include, I mean, just in the bold letters, you can see a list of again, the IRA strengths, right? And I thought it was especially helpful at Climate Justice Alliance to put this together. So there is in the IRA, the good parts, right? The funding to address air pollution, generally and in schools, and for diesel emission reductions, and grants to reduce air pollution at ports. And yeah, and to create the Office for Internal Affairs on climate change. But look at that. This is what I'm talking about when I say, you know, the amounts of money for one thing and another is just so unequal. So that office, 15 million to provide technical assistance to fight climate change in all of the territories. So American Samoa, Northern Mariana Islands, Guam, Puerto Rico, and US Virgin Islands, compared to 16 billion to rebuild the centralized grid, right? So there's just no way to really level the playing field. And so those are the other, you know, positive programs and good things that are in the IRA. But again, the numbers seem to be outweighed by just doing the business as usual option. And I lost the cursor. Here it is. Here it is. I found it. Okay. And then the threats, well, you know, the IRA entails extension and modification of credits for carbon oxide sequestration. Actually, that was also in the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act. There's like 12 billion for carbon sequestration and hydrogen. Yeah, the new thing, right? The hydrogen. Justifying, especially building new methane plants, because supposedly they'll be dual fuel converted to hydrogen, and not considering, for example, the nitrogen oxide emissions related to hydrogen burning. And so the list of, you know, fossil fuel projects in the IRA is daunting. Some biofuels detract from food production, but I heard today that actually Emory uses its food waste for biofuel production, which is really interesting. And you know, other objectionable things in that bill. And so the missed opportunities, I think, interesting, and it coincides with a previous analysis that I saw about it. The investment in mass surface public transportation is not in there. Lead pipe replacement, civilian climate conservation corps, right? That's a proposal to train youth and others in especially environmental justice communities, addressing cumulative impacts. We know that although we're in the midst of the climate crisis, in environmental justice communities, you know, carbon emissions disperse, right, and pretty much affect everyone in terms of air pollution. But carbon is usually accompanied by other emissions, like the criteria pollutants, for example, SO2, NO2, carbon monoxide, PM 2.5, PM 10. So those co-pollutants, you know, need to be addressed, and that's not necessarily happening. Funds to enable communities to be effective interveners in administrative processes for the energy utility regulators, right? The public service commissions, et cetera. And of course, community-based and owned renewables. That was a missed opportunity to a large extent in the IRA. And then I think I end with this quote from the Indigenous Environmental Network, that allocating comparatively meager amounts of grants and loans as environmental justice investments is like dangling a carrot in the face of tribal communities to open up their lands to harmful practices like carbon capture and storage, hydrogen, nuclear, forest and agriculture offsets, and biofuel development. And I think that's it in terms of the PowerPoint. Oh, yeah, I see 7 there. Right.
You can stop share too. That's okay. And here we go.
Uh-huh. Okay, so the first one is from Dominique. Is that, yeah? My name, I'm a first-year medical student here at Emory. I was born and raised in PR and only left for college and now medical school. I would like to know what people like me who live in the States but want to go back could do to help right now. Okay, yeah, so, you know, one thing that was so impressive was a show of solidarity with Puerto Rico, the plight of the residents on the island or in the archipelago in the aftermath of Hurricane Maria. It was just like massive, not just the Puerto Rican diaspora, but Latinx communities, people of good faith, just generally people just so concerned and trying to help. And I think what we're saying is, let's not wait for that to happen again. Let's do something preventative, proactive, you know, let's build something that will provide more resilience. And I think that generally speaking, we need people to talk to the decision makers here, get to the decision makers here, like the Biden administration, like Congress, the Congress people, like just publicizing that, you know, civil society groups, you know, after many studies, even by DOE and the University of Puerto Rico faculty that has been instrumental in other studies that other civil society groups have done, know what the viable option is here. And we should really try to implement that. From people in the states, that means especially impressing on FEMA the need to do something, to use those funds, to earmark those funds for resilient energy projects, right? And not rebuild the same system. And there are groups that we sometimes circulate petitions. We participate in congressional hearings coming up, like, for example, this September 22nd, I believe we have a hearing with the Committee on Natural Resources. That would, contacting them is great. Yeah, I mean, we can put you in touch with some of the groups at Puente that we mentioned. Yeah, and, you know, contact me. I'd be happy to discuss further. Okay, let's see what else we have.
Yeah, hi. First, thank you so much for just giving this talk and like informing us of what's going on in Puerto Rico right now. Like, it's extremely difficult to get administration to like even care about indigenous communities, like communities of color, and like places like Puerto Rico, when so many of these like politicians are kind of bought out by fossil fuel industries, etc. So I have a question regarding like the centralized model. You talked a lot about that and centralization, and I have questions regarding LUMA. Is LUMA like currently the main company that's like controlling all the centralized energy in Puerto Rico? Is it like private? Is it like US based? Yeah, I just have some questions regarding like LUMA and more about its influences and its leverage over Puerto Rico and the government.
Yeah, Ben, that's a good question. So as I said, Luma Energy seems to be like a joint venture that was created by Quanta Services, the biggest transmission company in the US based out of Texas, I think Houston, and ATCO Canadian Utilities. And they've done lots of big transmission projects. That's what they know how to do. It's a very 20th century company, right? It's like, let's do big centralized infrastructure projects. And what is energy, justice, or democracy? No clue, right? And so the way the deal is structured. The contract was entered into in June of 2020. And Luma had like a 1-year learning period and actually took over operation of the transmission, distribution, and other parts of the electric system other than not generation, right? Luma does not run the plants. Luma controls the movement of energy and the servicing of the accounts and that kind of thing. So what their incentive, Luma's incentive, is to really just rebuild the same grid, because the contract provides that they have control basically of that they will determine which projects are going to get built with the federal funds, assuming FEMA approves them. And so they have a really huge incentive to just, hire their own affiliate companies, which is what they've done, to both do the maintenance and the operation and the rebuild of the grid. So it's really locking in. It's inordinate control over federal funds that don't necessarily align with public policy and public service. And so I wanted to mention also that there are some private power purchase agreements, private plants that are run under power purchase agreements, right? So it is a public utility, purpose of public utility, but it has contracts with other private companies like the AES Corporation and a European conglomerate called Ecoelectrica, which is Gas Natural Fenosa, and other utility scale private projects. So I hope that answered. Yeah. Okay.
So I was just curious, the PSC in Puerto Rico, how much control does it have? Like how much can it regulate utilities or like corporations like Luma on how they do energy? Like can they kind of through like regulation force them to make more transition to like a decentralized or more renewable system? Or like the people that currently sit on the PSC body are even interested in doing that? I'm just kind of curious.
Well, I should say that our Energy Bureau, which is part of the Public Service Commission in Puerto Rico, is a relatively new organism. And so unlike, say, in the States, where these things have existed for over 100 years, the Energy Bureau is, it's what, 5 or 6 years old. And I guess the main instrument for regulating the electric sector is what is known as the integrated resource plan process. And we are now in the second period, the second integrated resource plan that the groups that I work with have been very active in trying to influence us as interveners. And theoretically, Luma has to abide by the integrated resource plan that's in effect, right? And the issue is that IRP mandates the integration of large amounts of renewable energy, but doesn't specify whether it's utility scale or distributed. And so Luma, it has no real, let's say, mandate there, right? And generation is still in PREPA's hands anyway. So Luma is just basically focusing on using the federal funds to hire its own affiliates to rebuild the same grid. And the Energy Bureau has not objected to use of its own affiliates as contractors. The Energy Bureau has not imposed metrics, real performance metrics. That we're working on a case very intensely with Earthjustice to get the kinds of metrics that would provide, much better service. But the case is still pending. So that hasn't happened. And so, no, we have not seen a lot of enforcement. We've had like these series of outages, like we had a huge one on April 6th, whole island-wide or archipelago-wide outage. A group of restaurant chains sued Luma for what they claim were voltage fluctuations that damaged their equipment, refrigerators, and you know, they've had to throw out like hundreds of thousands of dollars in food inventory, both at these restaurants and in public schools, for example. And the Energy Bureau says it's investigating. And this was not a single incident. And ever since Luma took over, we've had these really generalized outages or partial big outages, or just a lot of people without power on pretty much every single day. And the Energy Bureau is not being too diligent as far as we can see. Yep, back.
I was wondering if you can control for the impact of forests from the
Like, just with the, yeah, with the role and with the impact of forests and the remote consumers of energy, but perhaps not.
Interesting question. So I don't know, conventional tourism, like hotels are big energy guzzlers, right? And they have energy subsidies, surprisingly, you know, so the rest of us pay for their energy use to an extent. And I think remote working, what we've seen, I thought you were going to ask about the crypto millionaires that we have in Puerto Rico, yes, that have been attracted by yet another series of tax exemptions now on the individual basis. It used to be that we had the corporate tax exemptions, right? When Operation Bootstrap started, the economic model I talked about in the late 40s and 50s, and went through, I mean, still their corporate tax exemption decrees. But yeah, when was it? I guess, I don't know, maybe 5 years ago, the government enacted a personal individual tax exemption programs, and that has attracted high-income individuals to claim that they live, you know, 180 days or more in Puerto Rico, and so be able to have this incredibly, I mean, it's like a tax haven, incredible exemption from special capital gains tax and things like that. And that is attracting, wealthy people that don't necessarily invest a whole lot, or I can't see, I mean, and certainly crypto operations would use a whole lot of energy, a lot, you know, it's very energy intense kind of operation. But I mean, tourism can be a very, you know, important part of the economy. Right now, it doesn't, it's interesting because I know that Puerto Rico is seen as a really popular tourist spot, but it's not even double-digit contribution to the economy. It's less than 10% to the Puerto Rico economy, and the energy use other than the hotels. I don't know. I mean, certainly if it were ecotourism, it wouldn't be terrible, right? But it's mostly conventional. Oh, wow. Okay. Can somebody help me? Great group.
Yes. That's really cool. So I was sort of interested in whether, and I know that most people get to something, but whether you have any specific challenges or any advantages here, specifically like working as compared to someone else.
The political
culture.
Oh yeah, well, you know, there's a status issue, right? And as I said, I think everyone has asked me this question both last night and during the day today. the political culture, the political scene is very bifurcated, very controversial because there are, in addition to, I guess, liberal and conservative politics, we have a status issue that is somewhat cross-cutting. And what we see is that often the two major parties that have been in power might not be so different in terms of their energy policies, but minority parties that are gaining some influence do and seem to support, like the civil society proposal I mentioned. But I like to say constantly when people ask me about status issue, my response is always to the extent that Puerto Rico has a viable electric system or resilient and affordable, accessible, reliable electric system, that would benefit any of the status options, right? And make Puerto Rico viable as a place, irrespective of what option people choose, whether it's independence, whether it's the current status, whether it's a new sort of development of that current status that would be more like Marshall Islands thing, kind of free association, they call it, and or statehood. Puerto Rico needs to be a viable place. We can't, have our electric system destroyed every few years or partially or totally destroyed, and then, come back to FEMA and say, you need to rebuild it again. No, I mean, we know that there's a way to have a more resilient system to hurricanes.
So earlier you mentioned that one of the lessons learned was energy literacy. And I was just wondering what exactly it means to be energy literate and how communities and individuals can become energy literate.
Yeah, so let's face it, having rooftop solar on your rooftop is not easy. You really need to know how to manage these systems. And we've done some interesting exercises with the pilot projects where very, very positive results where people really learn to work with really small systems because we couldn't really afford, a full array, but where small systems have been very helpful and people have learned to manage their energy use. So average energy use in Puerto Rico is like 2/3 average US per capita energy use. And there are people, and then Professor Marcel Castro at the University of Puerto Rico has studied this and found that there are people, many people in Puerto Rico who can live with 2 kilos, 4 kilos. I mean, just a very moderate amount of energy. And that can be very convenient, very helpful for, this transformation that is needed. And so what does it mean? It means, first of all, learning how you can conserve energy, learning about energy efficiency, how, the same amount of energy can do more work, and learning about the equipment and how to maximize your batteries, and learning how to organize as a community to do maybe collective buying or management of the system, and providing sort of energy oases in your community, just any number of things that we need social scientists to work on. There's certainly a lot of social acceptance of that option, and but it does require education. We really have to be truthful about this. It's not like flipping a switch like right now and using indefinite amounts of energy or unlimited amounts of energy, even if maybe later you can't pay the bill. So it does require management savvy practices to maximize the system and keep costs down. Hi, Jim.
For this really important My question is about, energy rates in Puerto Rico. I was really struck by how high they are. Wondering why that is. I'm also struck by the fact that, I guess, can you talk a little bit more about the energy? So, it sounds like you have double the electricity rates in Puerto Rico. But median income is a third that of the economy in the US. Why is that exactly? And is there any relief cycle there? That seems like an emergency in itself.
Yeah. Yeah, you're absolutely right. I believe we may now be first or second highest electric rate in the US as a US jurisdiction. It's always been like Hawaii, Puerto Rico, Alaska with really high rates. And when you look at it, you can sort of understand we're isolated areas within the US. We are islands or, distant area, remote areas like in Alaska. And in both Hawaii and Puerto Rico, we don't have fossil fuel reserves, right? So everything has to be imported. So that dependence on, and usually islands have used a lot of residual fuel oil, either starting from anything from bunker C, tar almost to maybe more distilled ultralight sulfur or whatever. So I think it's a combination of, transportation costs, not having local production, because we don't have that kind of energy supply. Whereas, of course, here in the States, you have coal, you have gas, you have even oil. I mean, I know Louisiana still uses some oil for energy production, and you have quick ways to transport it. So I think that accounts for the difference in rates as islands and not having backup systems. So also on islands, you tend to need a larger reserve energy generation online. And so that, of course, increases your rates as well. So as you say, it's now about 33 cents per kilowatt hour when the average in the US is about 16 cents. And there are places that have much lower, right? I mean, 8 cents even. So yeah, and that, as you say, it creates a huge energy burden for people who are, have very limited incomes. And I guess it explains why this energy issue contributes to the exodus of people from Puerto Rico, especially low income and vulnerable populations.
So, this be ignorant question asking. So, what it seems to me that there's too many components of this issue here, aside from political issues, social issues, the climate issues, the terrain issues, but it seems to me that once this new centralized grid issue is back in 2000, that's not. If it takes a bet, and if this is the mentioned the Luma company, which is Texas-based, not 20th century company, which is probably that stronghold for many years, because that's why the political years around education, you get a lot of funding. So what are the ways, what is the more primary issue affecting, just as someone this infrastructure that they've had in place and making it more across the island and the central pockets, which you mentioned as well? Is that the major issue to the next 6 to 7 years of season for hurricanes to prevent these damages from continuing to take effect and cause other problems? Is that the major issue here, or is it just initially looking upon still relationships that we have in the immediate? I mean, what is the more kind of
So I would say that really, I'd go back to what Dr. Catalina Leonis says and postulates about energy justice having 4 pillars, right? It is certainly the decarbonization, especially for environmental justice communities that are impacted by this toxic emissions from the fossil-fired power plants. But decentralization is just as important. Democratization is just as important. This is not just a technological fix. We really need community-based organizations involved in the energy system, and this dependence on imports is not I mean, that needs to be addressed as well. So I would say those are the four pillars. And then I wouldn't venture to say that any of them is more important than the other. Because even with the utility scale projects, they took longer than the fossil powered power plants to reconnect and their energy generation, 15 months. So it's very complex. And I wouldn't venture to say any one of them is more important than the other.
Okay. We have a question in the chat, so I'm just going to read it to everybody. So this is from Catherine, who is a third-year student at Emory studying environmental science and data science. I like how she put environmental science first. My question for you is, how can researchers better communicate science to the public? More specifically, how can we make scientific reports more accessible to everyday people and more impactful for politicians?
Yeah, we see that a lot because we get all kinds of reports and studies for transformation of the electric system. And it's great work. I mean, for example, I'll give you the best example. So there's something called DOE put together, Department of Energy, federal government put together something called the PR 100, right? Because we have by law a renewable portfolio standard that says that we have to get to 100% renewable energy by 2050. And then, other intermediate goals. Wonderful studies, great stuff. But yeah, you really have to translate that into lay terms and disseminate that message in a way that people can understand it. Not to mention, it has to be translated into Spanish because we are primarily a Spanish-speaking population, and in the States, there are primarily, different language diversity groups. So it's like a double effort that needs to be made, put into, in the case of the States, plain English, or, in certain communities, in understandable Spanish. And I think people also, that actually seeing these things in practice, like the pilot projects that I mentioned, helps a lot. I mean, just to see one of the poorest communities in Southeastern PR just take hold of this project, and they know how to change the fans on those inverters, and they, it's like, it's impressive. And so that helps to really, so if you do the research, do some practical component, right? That's what I would say.
Okay, I'm wondering if we can actually start mingling with the coffee.
Sure,
Would that
sure,
work? I know that
yeah.
there are so many questions, but I think it might be a good idea because we still have the time, and then saying that we should have the coffee hour. So does that work for you all? About getting the coffee and then the cookies?
Okay.
Sorry, please join me in thanking Ruth for a great talk.
Thank you. Thanks all of you. I want to say though, in closing, that you guys have really grilled me. Since I got here, Emory is really top notch. Thank you. It's been great. And then I have the competition here, JB.
Okay. Well, thank you, everybody. And then I wanted